Hello and welcome guys, my name is Steve and welcome to yet another FPV video series where I share my experience when it comes to the FPV hobby, how to build an FPV quad, how to fly an FPV quad and all that stuff. And in this video we're gonna do something very interesting. We're not gonna jump into building right away. We're gonna explain the basics of an FPV quad, the basics of a quad like this one. So basically we're gonna explain what is a quad made of, what are the basic components, what are the components that make up an FPV quad and all that stuff. So hopefully that's gonna be interesting and let's jump into this video. And let's start with the first and most important component of an FPV quad, and that is the frame. That is this guy over here. There are different types of frames. As you can see, I got a lot of frames over here. I got this one, I got this one, and they're all for different cases. They're all for different purposes. So as I was saying before, the most important component when you build an FPV quad, and if you don't realize that in the beginning, you will definitely realize that later on, is the FPV frame itself. Now this is the most important thing in my opinion because you build everything on top of this. Depending on the video system you're gonna put in this frame, you're gonna choose a frame which is compatible with that video system. At least you don't wanna have a hard time, you don't wanna work around the frame, so you wanna pick up something which is compatible. That's why when picking up a frame, it's important to keep in mind the compatibility with the system you want to build. Like if you wanna build an HD system or an analog system, it all depends. So that's why choose a frame for the compatibility. Otherwise you're gonna have to work around this frame a lot, or even choose another frame because it doesn't work for your system. So when you pick up an FPV frame, make sure it's durable, make sure it's compatible, and make sure it does have the proper size, the size you need. So when it comes to picking up the size of an FPV frame, you don't want to go too big, especially in the beginning, because the bigger the frame, the bigger the quad is going to be and the bigger the damage is going to be when you're going to crash. And trust me, you're going to crash a lot in the beginning. That's why you want something maybe not too small, because you're not going to be able to put a GoPro on top or a bigger, more powerful battery to fuel your motors or something like that. That's why I would recommend something between 4 and 5 inch. Like most people go with 5 inch. Like my personal experience of 5 inch was amazing, except my latest drone. This one weighs a little too more and it's a little hard to control, but nevertheless 5 inch is perfect for flying an FPV drone, especially if you're getting started with FPV. That's why one of the most important thing to pick up and to take your time before you buy it is the FPV frame, and that's one of the most important thing which makes up an FPV quad. Another thing we're talking about, which is probably one of the most important thing, I keep saying one of the most important thing, but like look, this thing is very important. So the next thing we're talking about is the flight controller itself. So basically this is like the brain or the CPU inside a computer. So the flight controller is going to be responsible of telling your drone, telling your quad what exactly needs to be done, correcting some of the vibrations, the movements and all that stuff. When it comes to the flight controllers, as I was saying before, there are different types of flight controllers. So there are single or dedicated flight controllers. And basically these are just flight controllers attached with nothing else. So these are not PDBs, they are just flight controllers. So they have a harness. As you can see over here, they have a little harness. So you'll plug the cable like this, and then you pick up an ESC or a PDB, and there you go. So as you can see, this is a simple flight controller. It doesn't do anything but the flight controller job, and it leaves the rest to the PDB or to the ESC depending on your case again. As I was saying, there are two types of flight controllers. There are flight controllers which do just their job, and there are all-in-one flight controllers like this one over here, which also has a PDB, which I don't recommend using, but I have my own opinion about it, and I think you don't have to mix voltage and things which handle voltage like this one over here, because if things fry, the entire thing is going to fry, including the flight controller, and I don't like that idea. That's why I prefer to keep the flight controller individually. So basically when you buy a flight controller like this, or like an all-in-one flight controller, it doesn't really matter. You also have to make sure the flight controller is compatible with the configurator of your choice. So what exactly is a configurator? Well, A configurator like Betaflight, I chose Betaflight and most people out there choose Betaflight, but there are different types of configurators and the way you can configure this flight controller. So basically you don't write code from scratch in order to tell this flight controller how to control your drone, how to communicate with the ESC, how to communicate with the radio and all that stuff. All of this has been handled for you. And all of this is done via the configurator. So you just open up the configurator and from there on you just click a couple of buttons, enable a couple of switches, maybe do a couple of debugging over there. It's a very useful tool. As I was saying, it's important to make sure it's compatible with one of the configurators, because as soon as you build your drone, you also want to make sure you can configure your drone properly for your own needs, for your own pace. Because once you build your drone, it's not enough to just build it. You also have to adjust it to tune in and configure it for your own needs. You will need to adjust those things in order to fly a little smoother, because there are some defaults configured in this flight controller, but you may want to play with those defaults. That's why configurators come into play, and make sure you buy a flight controller which is compatible with the configurator you will most likely work with. So the next thing we're talking about is the PDB and the ESCs. What exactly are those things? And I'd actually say these are the most vulnerable things in your quad, because these are things which relate directly to the voltage, directly to the actual current which passes through. So let's first talk about the PDB. What exactly is the PDB? So the PDB is nothing else but the power distribution board. So basically PDB used to look like this in the past. So you would have something like that. You would have a small component which you would attach a battery lead on, and then from there on you would attach ESCs, motors and all that stuff. I would still consider using them. However, they have been replaced with something else, which is also a PDB. They've been replaced with something like this, which is nothing else but an all-in-one ESC. So what exactly is an ESC, or an electronic speed controller? Well, that's the thing which communicates between the flight controller and the motor. So as I was showing you before, this is a single or individual ESC. So basically the ESC would communicate with the motor, tell it how much voltage to give, how much to spin and all that stuff, and communicate back and forth with the flight controller. So the advantage of putting something like this in your quad, of putting a 4-in-1 ESC or an all-in-one ESC, is the fact that you get a clean build and everything looks clean and nice. And you don't have too many moving parts, cables and all that stuff, which I don't like personally, especially when you begin. It's a complete mess when you start building and you start crafting your quad. So what do you choose? Something like this or something like these? So basically it depends on your application. If you want to choose something like this, it's going to be a lot easier when you're going to replace that, because first of all, these will break a lot harder because they support bigger amps, cleaner voltage, and these break a lot more often. And if you break one of these, if you break one of the 4-in-1 ESCs, chances are you're gonna have to replace the entire board, which is not convenient because it's gonna cost you a little more money than that. However, I built my very first functional quad using individual ESCs and an all-in-one flight controller, which allowed me to just connect the two and have the quad fly in the air. But again, it depends on your use case. So whether you want to have something like this, which has lots of moving parts, it's very tangled and it just has lots of connections. And I don't like this. I don't like this because it looks ugly, and I like something which is cleaner and easier to work with. That's why I would prefer and recommend something like this, and we will be using something like this, in fact. That's why there are different kinds of ESCs, different kinds of PDBs, like there are 4-in-1 ESC, which you see over here. There are individual ESCs, there are all-in-one flight controller, which has the flight controller and the power distribution board, which allows you to plug in those ESCs. Or you can buy an individual power distribution board, plug in those ESCs, attach the motors, and attach the flight controller individually. There are so many ways to build a quad, especially in the FPV world, because there are so many providers, so many electronics, and There's just so many factors to pick. However, the most important thing when buying an ESC, and you have to consider that, you have to look it up, because otherwise you're gonna fry it and you're gonna have to buy it more and more often. So that's why when buying an ESC, whether you buy something like this, a 4-in-1 ESC, or something like this, an individual ESC, you have to pay attention of how many amps it supports. So this one supports something like 60 amps. This one, individual one, supports 45 amps. So 4 of these, like 45 amps, it's gonna be sufficient for any build, like really. So depending on your application, you'll need to buy something more or less powerful depending on your use, of course. So yeah, you have to pay attention of how many amps that ESC supports, because otherwise you're gonna fry your ESC. The motor is gonna say, I need this many amps, and it's gonna try to pull that many amps from the battery, but this ESC doesn't support that many amps coming and going through it. And it's gonna fry, and you're gonna have to replace the entire board in case you're using a 4-in-1. So pay very close attention, especially when you're buying 4-in-1 ESCs, because they tend to support a smaller amount of amps and they tend to break a lot easier. Alright, so the next component we're talking about, of course, is the power source. And that is the most important thing, of course, because depending on this, you're gonna buy certain components which are compatible with that power source. Now, another small but important thing when it comes to the power source is the power lead or the pigtail. So it's this small little thing. So basically you attach this power lead or this pigtail to the ESC or the PDB, and then you attach the battery and you have juice inside your FPV quad. So this is a small yet a very important thing in my opinion, and it's something which nobody talks about when building an FPV quad, but you will need one of these when building an FPV quad, because this is where you will plug your battery. So basically you will plug your battery like that and you will have juice. You'll have juice in your quad, and there's really no on or off power button like you see in a DJI drone, and everything is manual. So speaking of LiPo batteries, most LiPo batteries come with this special connector. It's called an XT60 connector, and most pigtails or battery leads are also XT60 connectors. So basically an XT60 is the connector which you are seeing right now. It's nothing else but the connector. So most batteries out there are going to be XT60, so you will attach a battery lead or a pigtail which has an XT60 connector. But enough of the pigtail, let's talk about the power source. When it comes to the power source, it's a very delicate topic when it comes to batteries, choosing batteries, charging batteries and all that stuff, especially in the FPV. So when it comes to a battery, there are different chemistries out there, but when it comes to FPV specifically, we choose the LiPo batteries. So basically these batteries are LiPo batteries or lithium polymer batteries. These are special and delicate batteries. That's why there's really a ton of theory how to charge this battery, how to discharge this, how to use these batteries and all that stuff. However, we use LiPo batteries because they are very powerful in a very small form factor. When it comes to buying LiPo batteries in the FPV hobby, one of the most important thing you will pay attention is the capacity and the C rating. So you all know that the capacity is the milliamp hours, how many milliamp hours a battery has, which is basically the capacity. You all know that. However, there is something else which you may have known about, may have not known about. That's the C rating. Basically, there's something like 50C, 95C, 100C. And basically that C rating means the discharge rate, so how much you can discharge this battery. So when it comes to batteries, specifically LiPo batteries, they don't like being charged too fast or being discharged too fast. However, when it comes to discharging, there is a specific measurement. That's the C rating. In layman terms, the bigger the C rating, the more amps at the same time you can drain off of this battery without damaging it. So basically, if you have bigger C rating, you're most likely going to pay a little more for the battery, but that's a little better because if you have powerful motors which require lots of amps, you will not damage this battery. If you have a battery which has like 20C or 50C and you have super powerful motors, then your battery will probably be dead after a couple of uses because the C rating of that battery doesn't allow to discharge the battery too fast. That's why make sure you pay attention at the C rating. But also when buying a battery, it's very important to know how many cells that battery has, because the more cells you will have, the bigger the voltage is going to be, and the more juice, the more power your quad is going to have. When you're gonna arm that quad, you're gonna fly a little faster if you have like a 6S battery rather than having a 4S battery. Cells are measured in S, so when you see something like 4S, 5S, 6S, that's basically how many cells a battery has. The more cells you have, the more voltage you have, which means you have a little more power to give to the quad, which means your quad is going to fly a little faster or something like that. But also, the more cells you have, the bigger the form factor is going to be. Like, for example, if you compare a 6S battery to a 4S battery, as you can see, it's a little bigger than that, which means it's gonna weigh a little more, and it may not be perfect for your case. Maybe you want something super light just for racing without any GoPro on top and something like that. So you want to save up space, you want to shave as much as you can, and maybe you don't want a 6S battery. That's why when it comes to the battery, there are different criteria of choosing a battery. That's the capacity, that's the C rating, how fast you will discharge that battery depending on the motors you will put on that quad. And there's also the number of cells, which is gonna give you more or less voltage, and that's pretty much it about the battery. So the next thing we're talking about, guys, is motors. What kind of motors you should use, or the importance of the motors when it comes to building an FPV quad in general. So in the FPV world, there are different kinds of motors depending on your application, again, depending on what kind of quad you want to build, how powerful you want your quad to be, and all that stuff. You will want to pay attention at a couple of numbers when picking up a motor. So when picking up a motor like this one, for example, you will see something like 2207, and you will see something else like 2450 kV. So what exactly those numbers mean? The first number, 2207, means the size of the motor, or in other words, the size of the stator. So basically the number 22 means it's going to be 22 millimeters wide. The stator, or this thing which has the coil on, is gonna have to be 22 millimeters wide, and it's going to be 7 millimeters tall, or the 07 means the height of the stator. So in other words, 2207, this number means the size of the motor, and depending on your application, depending on what kind of drone you have, what kind of frame you have, like a 5-inch, a 6-inch, 7-inch, 10-inch, depending on that frame, you're gonna have to put one type of motor or a different type of motor in order to spin smaller or bigger props, depending again on your specific quad you're building. Then we have the second number, as I said before. So in this case, in the case of this motor, we have something like 1750. This one has something like 2450 kV. So basically this kV means how many revolutions or rotations per minute, RPM, this motor is going to spin. So you may think faster, or the more RPMs you have, the better, but it depends on the case. Again, we're not going to talk about motors specifically in this video, because there are lots of theories, which there are guys out there who explain it so much better than I do. So yeah, these are some examples of motors which I've been using in my quads, and some of them we will be using in our specific build. However, motors are not the only thing which makes a quad fly fast, or it makes a quad have a lot of thrust and all that stuff. So also let's talk about propellers. Usually motors come in combination with propellers and the battery. What kind of battery you have, what kind of motors you have, and what kind of propellers you have. So there are different types of propellers out there as well. There are 2-blade propellers, 3-blade propellers. Choosing a prop is, again, subjective. It all breaks down to what kind of brand you use, what kind of how many blades the prop has, depending on your application. Like, we can talk propellers the entire day. It all depends on you, what kind of propellers you use, depending on your drone, depending on your case. And also, speaking of propellers, you have to make sure these things are durable, because you will crash a lot. And most propellers out there are pretty elastic. There are ones who are more elastic. Like, I have bent this one pretty hard. Like one of the blades was like very bent, and I was just able to restore this prop and fly it in the air, and didn't have any problems with that. So let's talk about radio receivers and radio transmitters a little bit. So this is the radio for the analog system, but you can also put an antenna in your flight controller and make sure you can drive your digital system with this one as well. And this one is the DJI FPV radio controller, and it doesn't really matter which one you use as long as you know how to move your sticks. So that is part number one of communicating between your quad and you, the pilot. You basically need a radio like this, and this is a one-time investment. You will buy this once and you will fly it with any kind of quad. You can go out with your friends and fly somebody else's quad by having a radio like this or by having a radio like this. Again, depending on the type of the system you will be using. Now you will attach an antenna like this on the flight controller in case you have something like analog system. However, if you have something like a digital system, you can still attach an antenna like this. But in most of the cases that is not needed, because you will have something like this. You will have a DJI Air unit which has everything inside of it. It has the camera over here, it has the Air unit, which is the VTX or the video transmitter. It also has the antennas which act as a video transmitter and signal receiver from your radio transmitter. So basically this entire system, which you buy as one unit, will act as the receiver of the radio in case you use a radio like this. When you buy a radio like this, you also have to consider the type of antenna it has, the type of external module it has, like this one over here, the latency, the range that radio supports, and all that stuff. But nevertheless, you will need a radio in order to fly your quad, in order to tell your quad, hey, I want to do this specific movement. Without it, you can't fly an FPV quad. That's why it's called FPV, first person view, right? So you need a radio whether you're flying something like this, meaning you're using a Taranis, or you're flying with something like this, like a DJI FPV controller. It doesn't really matter what you're using as long as you're a good pilot. That doesn't really matter. And it's all about picking what works best for you. So yeah, you need a radio in order to fly your quad, tell it what exactly the quad should do. And also you need something like a receiver. You need an antenna or DJI Air unit in that case, and attach this antenna on the flight controller and tell the flight controller that, hey, I'm receiving this type of signal. I'm receiving the signal that I want to go left, I want to go forward, and all that stuff. So yeah, you need a receiver as well. So now that I mentioned antennas, let's talk about antennas real quick. So there are different types of antennas out there. There are unidirectional antennas, something like this, or multi-directional antennas, something like this. So basically multi-directional antennas will send a strong signal when it comes to multiple directions, but the range it sends that signal is not going to be that far, is not going to be that long range. However, a unidirectional antenna will send a bigger signal or a longer range signal, but it's going to be in one direction. If you turn your head around or you move your radio around, it's not going to receive that great of a signal. And finally, guys, the last thing we're talking about, the last and also very important component, is the camera, the video transmitter, and yeah, the thing which makes the letter V from the FPV, which means first person view. So basically, whatever the drone sees, that's what you see in your goggles. So let's first talk about the camera. So as you can see here, I have a little camera like this one over here. So basically what this camera does, you attach it to your drone. Whatever the drone is going to see, that's what you're gonna see. So as you can see over here, I have the camera over here and it's tilted up like 25 degrees or so. And whenever the drone is like that, it's gonna fly, and whatever the camera is going to see, that's what I'm gonna see in the goggles. So when you pick up a camera, you have to be aware of the field of view of that camera, of how wide the camera can see, so that afterwards you can see that in your goggles and you can see more of the field and all that stuff. So that's why it's important to have wide field of view so that you see as many details as possible when you fly your drone. But the camera alone without something called the VTX or the video transmitter, which looks something like this, is nothing, because this little guy over here transmits the video feed to your goggles. The problem with this thing is the fact that it's analog, and we're not going to be using analog for this specific build, which we're about to build in the next videos. We're going to be using something like this, which I showed you earlier. We're going to be using the DJI unit, which is part of the DJI FPV system. So when it comes to the video system, you really don't have that big of a choice. You have actually two choices. You will either go digital and you're going to pick something like the DJI FPV system, because that's the only one which is reliable and good at the moment. Or you have the analog option, which brings a wide variety of options, lots of options over there. So most goggles out there which are compatible with the analog system, they actually don't have several things which the DJI FPV goggles already has built in. And that is the video receiver. So basically you need to have a video receiver to be able to receive that video feed, which is transmitted via the VTX or the video transmitter. And the DJI FPV goggles already has that built in. And you also need antennas, so you need to buy antennas for your specific goggles if you're using the analog system. And it really goes down to your choice, to your preference. There are advantages and disadvantages. I prefer the digital FPV system, and that's exactly what we'll be using in this build, which we will be building like very soon. So now that we talked about all the components which make up an FPV quad, an FPV drone, let me also show you a demo of how exactly these components interact and how exactly these components come into play. After you have the battery plugged in, the drone is ready to receive a radio signal from a radio controller, obviously. So you turn on the radio. Basically, the radio is going to tell the drone what exactly it needs to do. Now, be careful of this. Don't do this inside the home. As you can see, I have the props on. It's advised to remove the props. However, I think I'll be safe with it. So just trust me on that. As soon as you have your quad turned on, your radio turned on, your quad is ready to receive input signals, which is going to tell your drone how to function. I have a switch configured, so if I flip that switch, the drone is going to arm, and basically the flight controller is going to tell the ESC, hey, spin that motor, and it's going to tell each individual ESC to spin each motor. So as you can see, the drone is unarmed, it's waiting for signals, the beeper is yelling at me, and yeah, let's actually arm. So yeah, when you arm, as you can see, the drone is working. The motors are spinning. It's in the air mode at the moment, and I don't give it any throttle, because if I give it any throttle, it's gonna go crazy, it's gonna damage something inside the home. But anyways, as you can see, the drone is working. It's receiving input from the radio controller, and the flight controller is processing that input, and then it's telling the ESC to spin the motor, and the motor spins and the drone works, and that's how it pretty much works. Alright guys, so I'm super thrilled and excited to actually move on and build that quad which I promised you, which I had to deliver it a long time ago. So by the end of this video series, we will be building something like this. We'll be building something functional, something which feels like this, looks like this, and we'll go out in the air and fly this bad boy. So yeah, without too much talking, without further ado, let's wrap this up. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe if you aren't already, and I'll see you guys in the next video, because this video is taking too much time.